show of hands first, and I'm gonna have to squint a little bit because the lighting is brighter on me. How many of you, this is your first time being in New Orleans? Anybody? Wow, okay, good. So I grew up not far from here. I grew up in Houma, Louisiana, which is even closer to the Gulf of Mexico. Hey, nice. I love New Orleans. I love coming here. I love the energy that it brings, and I love that I'm not speaking on the morning after the attendee party, because usually that is pretty rough. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll get to in just a minute, but I want to tell you a little tiny bit about me after that intro. So I've been an MVP since 2002, and yeah, as my marvelous MC intro mentioned, I've been doing software development for a long time. I don't work as a professional developer anymore, but I've been around Microsoft a long time. And I like to think that I've got an ear for translating between what they say and what that actually means in the real world. So I'm going to try to give you the Paul filtered version of what Microsoft says about what they do around disaster recovery and resiliency. I've got 2 beagles and a cat. They get along fairly nicely, surprisingly. And in my spare time, which don't ask about it unless you want to get your ear bent, I love airplanes and everything that has anything to do with them. So the way this game is played, and there will be a few other audience participation opportunities during this, is that I'm going to give you 3 statements. One of them is not true, and the other 2 are. And you have to try to figure out which are the 2 truths and which is a lie. So we're going to get started with an easy one. By a show of hands, or actually, let me put them all 3 up, and then you can tell me which one you think is the lie. So, first statement, I've been interviewed on CNN. Second statement, I have driven the Formula 1 racetrack in Monaco. Third statement, I once ate 2 chicken McNuggets in one sitting. So, nominations for the lie.
McNuggets.
McNuggets? Okay, how many of you think it's the McNuggets? Okay, how many of you think it's CNN? Okay, how many of you think it's Monaco? Oh, man, I got to come up with better questions. I like McNuggets, but 32 of them in one sitting? Was it the number that gave it away? If I had said like 15, that would have been more believable? Okay, I'll work on that for next time. They're really good if you dip them in honey, by the way. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today, first, I want to talk about what backup means. Microsoft has got their own very firmly grounded opinion about what backup means, but they just changed it earlier this year, and I want to talk about that a bit. I want to talk about setting boundaries, not in the Dr. Phil sense, but in the sense of understanding what security boundaries or functionality boundaries apply when you're talking about backups. Then I want to talk in a little bit more detail about what Microsoft says about their backup and your need for backup, and then turn that into a discussion of the difference between restoring data and recovering your business operations. Because there is a significant difference between them. So what does backup mean? Well, the classical definition that you've all heard a zillion times is 3-2-1. So 3 copies of the data, 2 physical media types, 1 copy offsite or offline. We've had this definition since the early 60s when tape became an existing backup medium. And the definition, in a lot of ways, is still what people think of when they think of backup. But in the cloud world, you have to ask if that definition still makes sense in the same way. Okay, how many of you are currently doing backups of some kind that go to a physical location that you control? Your data center? Okay, very small number of hands compared to what it would have been 5 years or 10 years ago, right? How many of you would say that the bulk of your business operations are cloud-based, say more than 50%-ish of what you do? Okay, so you look around, there's a pretty good... The people that are raising their hands to say that I'm cloud, and the people who are not raising their hands to say that they have backups on-prem, which is sort of what you would expect. But we're in this weird sort of liminal zone right now, like Twilight, where people are still moving some of their business operations out of the cloud, or sorry, into the cloud, but their backups have not necessarily caught up, or they may not be doing backups at all. So that leads to these follow-up questions like, well, okay, if I say that I'm doing backups offsite, what does that even mean? If I'm doing them to the same cloud that my production systems are in, does that count as offsite? Do I have immutability? Do I really have immutability? Despite what the vendor says. Do I need it? These are the kind of questions that hopefully people are thinking about when they look at that 3-2-1 definition and go, yeah, I don't know about that. I'm a little skeptical. So let me suggest a more modernized definition that might make sense. We'll still keep the idea behind 3-2-1, right? So we want to have our original data plus 2 copies. That's the 3. We're going to have 2 different storage security boundaries. It doesn't really make sense to talk about media types in a world where all of us are on spinning disks or SSDs, right? If you still have tape backup, that puts you in a minority that gets smaller every year. Now, very much like floppy disks, I think we're going to see tape media still be around for a long time because it's pretty firmly entrenched, but it's not what I would consider to be a growing storage segment. And we're not going to see more new people moving their backups onto tape. And then at least one of those copies needs to be immutable by a reasonable person's definition of immutability. For me, that definition is not just I check the box in Azure Blob Storage to say, make this immutable, right? You need something with a little bit more horsepower behind it than that. So keep in mind that these are minima that I recommend, right? In other words, if you can have more than 3 copies of your data, hey, that's probably good. If you can have more than 2 storage security boundaries, that might also be good, right? You have some latitude here, but this is the floor that I would encourage you to consider when you're deciding whether or not you have real backup. Now to get there, I want to ask a couple of questions to help frame what we're talking about. How many of you think that keeping a backup copy in the same cloud as whatever production system you're backing up actually counts as a real backup? Nice. My work here is done. How many of you are subject to, or at least familiar with, or have heard of the NIS2 directive in the European Union? Okay, very small number of hands, which is what I would expect, because this is primarily going to be a North American audience. So let me talk about that super briefly. I don't want to turn this into a referendum. If you've ever seen one of the Nike or sports commercials where there's some big burly guy with 2 ropes and he's doing this, right? You know what I'm talking about? Well, the European Union is doing that with their end of the rope for regulation. So they are applying regulations that apply to the EU and to companies that do business with the EU. And those regulations are going to end up shaking our end of the rope here. So what the EU NIS2 directive requires is that for people that are subject to it, they are required to keep a backup that is physically separate from their cloud systems. Now, looking around the room, it doesn't apply to most of the people in here. But as sure as GDPR has leaked across the ocean onto our side, and we're starting to see an increase in North American privacy requirements and privacy regulations, you will see NIS2 start to leak into our world. So that regulators who look at that in the US, and it might be the SEC, it might be individual states, we don't know, but some regulator is going to look at that and go, yeah, that's a good idea, we should copy that. And I mention that just so you'll be aware of it and it's not a surprise when it happens. All right, how many of you have heard of Storm 1087? Wow, okay, somebody hadn't been reading my columns. How about Storm 501? So these are 2 specific attacks, and the reason I used Mango Sandstorm as a name is just because that's Microsoft's terminology. Different vendors call these threat actors different things. But in both of those cases, these are examples of threat actor campaigns where the whole MO is that they break into an on-premises environment. They compromise an account, they move laterally through AD until they can get privileges on AD, then they move laterally from there into the associated Entra tenant and start blowing things up. If you're familiar with these campaigns and you know that they are state-sponsored, state-operated, and that they mostly have targeted government and state actors. But know this, and if you went to Alex's talk this morning, you will already have heard this. The acts that require a nation state today get democratized so that tomorrow a criminal gang can mount those same kinds of attacks. And next week, a 15-year-old living down the street in his mom's basement can mount those kinds of attacks. We have seen that over and over and over again with ransomware. And we are starting to see that same trend of democratization for these kinds of attacks that target backups and backup infrastructure. So it may not be in your neighborhood yet, but the writing is on the wall. So with that said, let's talk for a minute about boundaries and what makes a good boundary for backup. Because this is absolutely something where Microsoft is, if I say lying, that sounds bad. They're saying things in a way that makes them look better maybe than they are. And it's important that you understand that. How many of you remember when Microsoft first came out with the immutable laws of computer security around the time of trustworthy computing? Man, that was a brave thing for them to do because their own software was enabling their customers to break most of those laws because it was sucky. Microsoft has come so far in their security capability and their posture since then. But law number 3 was that if a bad actor has unrestricted physical access to your computer, it's not your computer anymore. That law was true when it was promulgated in 1998. It was true when Microsoft revised those laws. It's still true today. But I'm going to propose a modification, which is that if a bad guy has unrestricted access to your cloud, it's not your cloud anymore. The threat actor may not be able to get physical access to the servers in the cloud. I make this point all the time when I talk to people about Entra, disaster recovery. Because customers will say, well, I'm not worried about ransomware because I'm only using Entra in the cloud. Well, okay, true. That ransomware is not going to attack the physical server that's hosting Entra in Microsoft's data center. You probably don't need to worry about that. But physical server compromise through ransomware is not the only security threat that's out there, as we've seen with these Mango Sandstorm attacks. So if you have a hybrid extension to your cloud, that's probably not a security boundary. If you're using directory synchronization, if you're enabling SSO between the on-prem and cloud environments, it's definitely not a boundary. You might remember years and years ago, Microsoft first said that AD domains were a security boundary, and they had to backpedal that real quick and say that the forest was a boundary. Well, we're starting to see some murmurings from them that, yeah, maybe they recognize that a single hybrid relationship cannot contain a boundary. So, like I said before, and I know I'm reiterating this point, but it's important that you all understand it. If your boundary is the distinction between your cloud service and your backup service, it's probably not really a reliable security boundary. So with that said, let's segue into some truths and a lie about what Microsoft says. So first statement, we probably won't lose all your data at the same time. Now, to be clear, I just made that up. They don't literally say that anywhere. But if every time you see the phrase shared responsibility on Microsoft's website, if you mentally substitute that for we probably won't lose all your data, you'll be on the right track. You share responsibility for your data protection with your cloud vendors. Our native data protection is good enough, and you don't need third-party backup. Okay, so how many of you think number 1 is a lie? Good, good. How many of you think number 2 is a lie? Okay, got a couple hands. How about number 3? Yeah, okay. So here is the truth about that. Microsoft's native data protection is very good for what it protects. As an example, in Exchange Online, every mailbox has got at least 4 copies, right? There's the primary copy, there are 2 active backup copies, there's a 4th lagged copy. So the odds that Microsoft is going to lose all of your mailbox data, very low. That doesn't mean that they logically protect all of your mailbox data. They're just promising that they won't lose it. That failure of a disk, failure of a server, failure of a data center is not going to result in all of your mailboxes going away. Now I can tell you from experience, we had a customer who, very large retail bank, whose name you will have heard of, was doing some testing, migrating their on-prem file servers to OneDrive. They had a bad design decision in their retention policies that was coupled with a bug in the way Microsoft implemented those policies. And they lost about a month's worth of OneDrive data for their pilot users, some of whom happened to be regulated under SEC or banking regulations. Meaning, when you lose the data that belongs to a regulated person, you have to call the regulator and tell them, hey, I lost this data. So they went to Microsoft and they're like, hey, we lost this data. It's gone. Can you help us get it back? Well, what did you think Microsoft told them? Right. Oh, that's tough, man. What are you going to do about that? And keep in mind, this is for one of the largest 20 corporations in North America. If Microsoft can't help them, they're not going to help you. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that they're unkind or mean or anything. It's just they cannot guarantee backup of every single piece of data. So they invest to protect against the things that they are most concerned about, which is loss of service capability, not loss of individual data items. So that's point number one that I want you to take away when you hear what they say about data protection. Point number two is their protection is not evenly distributed. Right? I want you to think about Popeye. Popeye's got big old forearms, right? Little skinny legs. Microsoft has got great native data protection for some parts of some workloads, and in other parts of other workloads, they don't. So you need to be very mindful of cross-checking what Microsoft protects well with what is important to your business. One area, and I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this if you didn't already know this, but one area where Microsoft's protection is not real good is Entra, right? Now again, they're promising, thanks to Entra's architecture, that they're not going to lose all of your data from all of the replicas of it worldwide all at the same time. They don't promise that they won't ever lose any of it or that they will be able to help you get it back if you do something or if something is done to you that causes you to lose some of that data. So if you think about conditional access policies, for example, how many of you have been listening to Chase and Dr. Zero Trust and following his advice about implementing CAPS and getting to zero trust world? Anybody? Pretty typical. It's still fairly early life for conditional access policies in a lot of orgs. But there's no protection for those. There's no undo, there's no recycle bin, there's no versioning, there's none of that. So if you make a bad change to a policy, it's exactly like making a bad change to the registry back in the day. You make a change, you reboot your machine, and now you're blue screened. Okay? Microsoft doesn't pretend to help you with that, but they're also not real clear on where their protection boundary there is. Now, some of you may know that Microsoft now offers their own backup product. Actually, let me turn that into a question. How many of you knew that Microsoft has their own backup product now? Okay, a few, but not as many as I would have expected. They only enter markets when they think there's some reason for them to be in that market. The reason may be, like Copilot, that they want to drive people to spend more money with them. The reason may be that there's a competitive threat, or it may be both. So in the backup world, it's fair to ask, okay, if Microsoft is selling this product now, they went from saying, nah, you don't need backup, we got you, to saying, we have this great backup product and you should buy it. Does that show a lack of confidence? Does that show a desire to collect more money from each of us? Is it somewhere in between? I don't know, right? I can't read their minds. But the fact that they have entered that market tells me they do think there's something there that's tied to one or both of those reasons. All right, so before we get into more depth about what Microsoft does and doesn't protect and what you should or shouldn't worry about protecting, I want to talk for a minute about the difference between restoration and recovery. And one way that I found to do this with people that really gets the point across is to outline a scenario. Not quite a tabletop, but close to it. So imagine that you've had this compound catastrophic failure where you've lost some or all of your directory and IDM data, plus some or all of your M365 data. And a genie appears in your office. Because this is New Orleans, right? So let's say it's a voodoo practitioner in your office instead. Maybe that's better. So a magical being appears in your office and they hold up a USB stick and they say, hey, great, I've got all of your missing M365 data right here on this stick. Now let me stipulate this is a positive spiritual force, so the stick doesn't have malware on it or anything like that. This is not one of those trick questions. So they give you the stick and you say, great, I've got all my data back. Does that put your business back to normal operations? No, of course not. What are you going to do with the stuff on the stick? That would be like saying, hey, I gave you printed copies of all your emails. Are you good to go? No, you were definitely not good to go. So just getting the data back is not enough to get you back to normal business operations. But if you take the next step from that belief and say, just putting the data back where it came from is often not enough. What do I mean by that? Okay, so let's say that I've had a failure and I lost all the mailboxes for my security team, let's say. Well, I don't know about y'all, I try to pamper my security team because I always want them to be able to work when I need them to work. I want them to have what they need to get online and mitigate threats and fix stuff. So I lose their mail and I say, okay, great, I'm going to put all your mail back. When all their mail is back, does that resume normal operations for them? Arguably. Depends on how much of their workflow depends on having mail. But I bet for each of you in every organization that you represent, you can come up with a flow where just putting the data back by itself is not sufficient to turn things back to normal. That's going to depend on what you do and what the key players in your organization do. But for 90% of us, just running a restore job, if I can use some ancient phrases, does not mean that your business is ready to throw its doors open after a disaster and get back to normal. There's all the logical work of making sure that the right data got put back in the right places, that all of the data is back where it's supposed to be, and that people can function. Because to give you one example, how many of you in here use Salesforce? Or your organizations use Salesforce? Most people don't like to admit that they personally use it. It's kind of dirty, right? It makes you want to wash your hands. So if your organization is using Salesforce, you may not know, some Salesforce objects are generated by the system. So for example, if I have an invoice in Salesforce, that invoice is really a query that gets all the line items that were sold to a customer and an opportunity. So to make the invoice, I can't just restore that data. I have to restore the data and then push a button in Salesforce that says, go recreate this invoice. So just restoring that Salesforce data or Dynamics data or Power BI data does not return you back to normal ops. There's some manual post-patch stuff that you have to do too. So I want you to keep that in mind as you answer these questions. How many of you today are backing up any part or all of your 365 estate? Oh, that's not many, man. That's not many. How many of you back up Entra? Okay, y'all are legit scaring me now. Which of those two would you rather lose if you had to pick one? Who would rather lose all of their Entra data? Okay. How many of you would rather lose all of your M365 data? I see a lot of hands not going up at all, right? Which I get. So this is a terrible choice. It's like, okay, which pet am I going to save from the burning house, right? Because there are people who will stand with a very straight face and say, well, if I lose all my Entra data, I don't care because it's all dir synced from on-prem anyway. Right? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands about that. But it turns out that although that it is true that you might be able to reconstitute users and groups, you're not going to get back all the attributes on those objects that are cloud only. You're not going to get back conditional access policies, app registrations, all the other cloud only data. And I would argue that if your business depends on those things today, then you can't get back to normal without being able to recover and restore them. Now, you could argue, okay, I only have 2 conditional access policies. I can recreate those in 5 minutes. Great. If that's the case, then I tip my hat. That's not often the case. I met with a customer last week that had 119 conditional access policies. That was my facial expression for a minute when they told me that, just like, you have how many? 80,000 seat enterprise, so they're complicated, multinational, multi-location. Their goal is to try to get down to 20. How many of you have more than 20 caps today? Okay, good. Small number of hands. So if you had to rebuild those things, yeah, you probably could. If you had to re-register all your app registrations, you probably could. It's not that it's impossible, it's that every minute you're doing that, the clock is ticking, right? And you definitely have to be mindful of that during a recovery. Because remember, your goal is not just to recover the data, your goal is to restore normal business operations. So while that clock is ticking and people can't log in, or your apps can't run, or you have to make security exemptions, or people don't have the data they need to work, for every second that's happening, that's costing you money. You have to decide, does it cost me more money if Entra is the point of failure, or if M365 is a point of failure? If you're not backing up either of them, then, man, I don't know what to tell you. So like I alluded to before, it's not enough just to put the data back. That's a prerequisite. You have to do it, but it's not the only thing you have to do, and the process doesn't stop there. Because the users that you're supporting depend on being able to, I was going to say come to the office, but okay, maybe not. They depend on being able to take a device and log into it and do the work that they do, whatever that is, right? I don't know enough about your individual businesses to come up with a single prescription, one size fits all, but the prescription that I can give you, and this is absolutely a truth, is that the users need both ends of that spectrum. They need the directory and identity management and security that wrap around it so that they can authenticate and be authorized to do what they do. Without that, it doesn't matter if they have email, for example, if they can queue up messages in their outbox, it can't be sent because they can't authenticate, right? That's exactly like working on an airplane in 1998 before in-flight internet was a thing. You can do a lot of work and you can stay really busy, but you're not accomplishing anything if you can't actually communicate with the people that need to receive your communications. So you might say, well, okay, we're not powered by email, we're powered by this other workflow thing that we do that doesn't involve email. Okay, but it's still true. Whatever cloud-based application you use, if people can't log into it, then you're dead in the water. Now, I want to talk about something that is near to my heart, but that people don't like to talk about. And that's prioritization. So thank you all for prioritizing being here instead of going to Darren's roadmap session. I was honestly a little concerned that I have like 3 people in the room, so sincere appreciation for y'all coming. Not all your data is equal. And you know that, and I know that, but your business may not have thought through what that means. Every backup vendor, Semperis, Keepit, those other ones we don't like to talk about, every backup vendor is going to say, yeah, we protect all your data. And that's true, but protecting all your data is not gets you back to normal business. It's able to back up the most important data and restore it quickly. So if you don't know what data is most important, and I see this all the time, right? So my job at Keepit, alongside product management, is to go talk to the biggest customers and find out what they need to be able to protect their data. So I routinely go talk to companies that have 100, 200, 300,000 users. And the number of them that have no DR plans around M365 would shock you. Because they don't think of it as being important until somebody says, oh yeah, we use that one SharePoint site for tracking all of the currency trades we make to hedge jet fuel prices. You think that might be important? So if you don't know what's important, there's no way that you can promise an acceptable recovery interval. There's no way you can tell your business leaders how long it will take you to get back to normal if you don't know what you have to restore to get back to normal. Now, I'm not going to lie, prioritization hurts. If you have ever moved from one house to another, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's easier to just throw all the crap in a box and then move the box to the new house and leave it in the box. But all that does is just pile up technical debt and aggravation that at some point you're going to have to pay for. Right? If you're lucky, your survivors will end up having to solve that problem by opening all those boxes in your attic that have been there for 30 years. But realistically, all you're doing is you're packing stuff up for the next move. So in the same vein, prioritization hurts, but not prioritizing hurts more, and the hurt lasts a lot longer. Because the time to find out that, oh damn, we have this really important team that didn't get backed up, and now we don't have that data, and now nobody can do job X. Well, the time to find that out is not when you discover that you can't restore, right? All of you have probably had the experience of thinking that you had a good backup of something and then finding out that it was bad when you went to restore it. Lord knows I have. If you haven't, then good. I don't wish that on you. But if you have, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. The time to find out is not in the emergency when you need that restore. So, real life conversation that I had last week in Germany. Sitting across the table from a customer who looked me in the eye and dead ass said, I have 1.2 petabytes of SharePoint data, and I don't know what's most important in it. Like, he was challenging me, like, well, I don't know what's important. What are you going to do about that, Mr. Backup Guy? It's like, well, I'll back it all up, but you're not going to enjoy the experience very much, because if you don't know what's important, I can't help you prioritize recovering what's important. Okay, so I know so far I've been kind of intermixing talking about Entra and talking about 365, and that's on purpose, because Microsoft means for those two to be very closely intermingled and to be very tightly coupled. So restoring one without, or let me rephrase that. Having the ability to restore one without having the ability to restore the other is sort of like trying to pick up a barbell by one end. And you can, right? But it's clumsy, awkward, it's injury prone, it's hard to move a lot of weight doing that. It works a lot better if you can lift both ends, or better yet, lift in the middle. So when you think about backing up Entra, for those of you that are not already doing it, the first thing I want you to think about is what I call the 4 M's. Why might you need to back up Entra data and be able to restore it? Well, there are mishaps, which are mistakes that you make. There's malice, which is when you get attacked, maybe from an internal disgruntled user who has authorization, maybe from an external source. There's mistakes, which is a thing that Microsoft sometimes does. By the way, quick show of hands, because this is a fun question. How many of you were affected by Microsoft losing 2 weeks of security log data in September? Anybody? How many of you knew that Microsoft had lost those 2 weeks of log data? Okay, good. That's better than the last time I asked this question. If you didn't know that Microsoft silently lost 2 weeks of log data for some of their customers, you might question your news intake and make sure that you're paying attention to outlets that tell you things like that. Because it's kind of important, right? If you don't have your security logs, that's the thing that most customers will want to be made aware of. So Microsoft makes mistakes. This is not down-talking them at all. It's their company, they're run by humans, and sometimes those humans make mistakes or they write code that has bugs, right? This is not news. The 4th M is maybe a little more controversial, migration. So keep in mind, I used to work at a company whose primary product line was migration products, and I always wanted people to do a backup before a migration and then another one afterwards, just to give them 2 known good anchor points that they could restore from. So how are you going to mitigate these things? Well, it depends, right? It depends on what your threat model is, it depends on what your budget is, it depends on what you're worried about. So if I were going to ask each of you individually, I wouldn't do this in a group because I think it leads to a degree of groupthink. But if I had the opportunity to sit down with each of you and say, all right, which of these 4 things are you actually worried about with Entra? Is there anything here that keeps you up at night? I think the mix I'd get would be different. Some of you are probably more worried about external threats. Some of you might be more worried about insider threats. Some of you, and I feel this in my heart, are probably worried that while you're here in New Orleans having a great time, the people that you work with who maybe aren't as smart or well-trained as you are grievously breaking things that are going to cause you hours and hours of pain when you get back to fix them. Definitely not asking for a show of hands on that one, right? Because your environment is only as good as your least skilled administrator. We've known this for a long time. Depending on what you're worried about, that's going to depend on how you try to mitigate these things. But it turns out backup for Entra is a pretty good mitigation against all of these. Now, one point that I want to be really clear on, because I don't want anybody walking out of here under a misapprehension. You cannot back up every single data item that's in Entra. There are a large number of things that have no API to get them, or they'll have a graph API to read them but not to write them, or you need restrictive permissions to be able to write them that nobody's actually going to grant to a third-party vendor, etc. Right? So there's some things that you cannot effectively back up and restore. That's why I said instead of eliminating these threats, really what we want to talk about is try to mitigate their impact as best we can. So no matter what you're doing, no matter what your level of concern around Entra is, I guess my first takeaway is, if you are using conditional access policies, please have some way to restore them. That might be as simple as a PowerShell script that will recreate the policies from scratch. I have customers that are using Terraform to do that. There's a pretty good product called Simian Cloud from CoreView that can automate building pipelines to do infrastructure as code. Obviously, Simpress and I would both love it if you bought our respective products, but have something to protect those policies. Because to me, that's a fundamental building block. If you lose those policies, it doesn't matter if you have user accounts or app registrations or the other Entra objects in place. If you lose those caps, you can't adequately keep people out at the first level of network access. And that's so important. I thought my clicker had died for a second. All right, so I want to close by asking you to consider some questions that once you've considered them and taken the appropriate action, they're going to make your life happier. Honestly, if you go through this process, you ask these questions, you apply the results, and your life is not happier, then come back to HIP next year and I will personally buy you a beer. Right? You all heard me say that. So first, what data items do you actually need to be able to get back to normal-ish operations? A couple of caveats. One, the answer cannot be, I need all my data. No, you don't. Right? Imagine that a natural disaster strikes and you lose access to your house and to all the contents of it. The nature of the disaster doesn't matter, but you're told, okay, for 3 months you cannot retrieve anything from your house. Make me a list of the 10 things that you need from your house for the next 3 months and I will go and get them for you. Okay? This is that same kind of exercise. What are the most important things that your business needs? And if you don't know, ask somebody. Somebody in the business must know. If nobody knows, I don't know what to tell you there. Get on LinkedIn, start looking for another job, right? Because that tells me that your business operations understanding is not where it should be. But the goal here is you want to think about the minimum viable set of data that you have to be able to do whatever your business does. Delivering boxes, flying airplanes, drilling for oil, teaching university students, whatever it is you do, what's the minimum set of data that you would have to be able to keep doing that? That's what you want to protect first. Second, are you backing that data up? So Jim Mattis, who was a legendary Marine, or still is, I should say, and was Secretary of Defense for a while, has 3 questions that he always wants his staff to ask. And I stole this because I think these are 3 really useful questions for framing discussions like this. The first question is, what do I know? The second question is, who else needs to know? And the third question is, did I tell them? So apply Mattis's principles here. What data is most important for me to back up? Am I backing it up? Am I sure that I'm backing it up? In other words, if I tested my backups, can I do restores? Do I know how long things take, etc.? This is all disaster recovery planning 101. So I know many of you are hearing this and going, yeah, okay, Paul, you're telling us stuff we already know. But the reason I'm telling you is because not everybody does it. When you go to your dentist and your dentist says, you should brush more, right? You may be going, yeah, people tell me that all the time. But it doesn't mean it's not true. Okay? I guess as an example, I should have said my dentist, because he tells me that brushing twice a day is sufficient, and I do it, and every time I see him anyway, he says, are you brushing twice a day? Hand to God, yes, twice a day, every day, and yet we still have to have that awkward conversation. Okay, third question to ask. What would a successful end-to-end minimum viable data set, or minimum viable product, I snuck that acronym in there, what would that look like for you? The answer is going to be individualized for every organization that's represented in here, because what an airline needs versus what a car manufacturer needs versus what a currency trading firm needs, it's all going to be different. But the question is intended to get you to think through, okay, what would I need to be able to get my operations up and running, with the caveat that I'm not trying to put everything back. I'm just trying to get the minimum, fastest, shortest path to semi-normal operations. It's okay if you don't know right off the top, because you can look back at this first list of stuff to prioritize and say, okay, well, let's say I could only restore the #1 item on that list. What would that look like? Who would be able to work? Who wouldn't be able to work? Is that acceptable? If the answer is yes, then great, you're done. If not, then you add the second item and you ask that same question. This does not take long to do. You don't have to have a PhD in disaster recovery. You don't have to have any certifications or specialized knowledge. You just have to have a good understanding of what data types there are in 365 and have some ability to ask the business operations folks what they would need to be able to keep things going. And then finally, how does your identity management strategy play into this? As an example, I have a customer in Switzerland. So as you would expect, they are very Swiss in everything that they do. Their disaster recovery plan is printed out in 7 locations and kept in 7 physically separate safes. And it's printed, you notice I said, they don't keep it online because what if you can't get to it online? They have a completely separate M365 tenant with 200 users already provisioned and ready to go. So in their DR plan, somebody's going to open the safe and take it out, and they're going to get to a step that says, activate the crisis tenant. It sounds very serious when I say it that way. And that's their signal to tell the 200 or so most critical business users to log into this alternate tenant and do their jobs. For those of you that are old enough or experienced enough to remember the phrase dial tone recovery for Exchange, that's what they've implemented, because they want the ability at any point to push a button that says, okay, our entire existing tenant is unusable, untrustworthy, unavailable, whatever the reason is. So we're just going to walk over here to our warm standby tenant, and we're just going to keep on doing what we do. Now, admittedly, that's on the really high end of preparation. They spend a lot of money to buy this extra tenant and put licenses in it and so on. So I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to be able to do that, but it's worth considering. What does your strategy around identity management and identity recovery look like, and how does it play against these requirements? If your plan is, okay, I'm going to recover my M365 data and then everything will be great as long as nothing happens to Entra, that's worth considering. If your plan is, well, I'm going to recover Entra, but then I don't care if anybody has email or Teams because who needs those anyway? I mean, that's certainly a strategy, but you need to be thinking about picking up both ends of the barbell. Finally, are you comfortable with the data protection boundaries that you have today? So if you're using M365, you're using Entra, that means you already have sort of put a marker down on Microsoft. It means you trust them with your data. That's the result, or that's what you're telling the world about giving them money to operate your cloud services. Do you trust having your backups there too? I mean, my answer is 100% of the time going to be no, but that's not picking on Microsoft, because it would equally be no if I were hosting things in AWS, or God forbid, I guess I should have asked earlier, any Google Workspace customers in here? Ooh, one, okay. Well, she's sitting right under a spotlight, so I can see her. Maybe that's why. Yeah, your identity management and recovery strategy will obviously be very different if you're using Google products, but I'll save that for a happy hour discussion. So keep these questions in mind, walk through them and think through them as I've outlined. And like I said, if you're not satisfied with the results, come back next year and the beer's on me. So with that said, I'll take questions.
Yeah, this is also on. Any questions for Paul? We got some time for maybe 1 or 2. Because I'd have one, and then he's already answered it a little bit at the end with that Swiss customer having basically a DR tenant. And I'll ask it, how quickly do you believe people could actually implement a disaster tenant in a DR situation? Because, you know.
So that's a really good question, because as you probably all know, there's nothing Microsoft likes better than for you to go into the M365 Admin Center, go to the Billing tab and click Buy Now. So you could make a new tenant really quickly if you were willing to have a cloud-only tenant with a subset of licenses billed to somebody's credit card. But the number one thing I see when customers are talking about DR planning in the cloud is that they don't know what they should do. The second thing I see is they don't have any way to reliably tell people that they're doing a recovery. So if you imagine saying, I want to be able to tell people that we're doing a recovery and I'm going to email them or I'm going to send them a message on Teams, you start to see the problem with that, right? In olden days, we just assumed, okay, if my data center is on fire or underwater or has been destroyed by a tornado, then I will have a phone tree of some kind that I can use to call people. But man, that's old school. People don't have phone trees anymore. They have contacts that are in the cloud that they can't get to.
And I guess the key thing is also, for those that, you know, live in a hybrid world, you have your on-prem Active Directory. It's not so difficult to recover AD in a separate network as a clone of your original AD with the same identities. If it were a separate tenant, new identities, no object IDs, new permissions that need to be set,
Exactly.
etc. So it's a nightmare. So without that preparation, it's going to take a lot of time. So, but I love that.